everybody, it's Brett, and welcome to FMW Stories, Episode 3, where I'll be going over a specific topic in detail about FMW or something related to FMW in story form. Today's episode, we're going to be going over the life and times of Megumi Kudo. Megumi Kudo would be born on September 20th, 1969 in Koshigaya, Saitama. Her birth would be very difficult for her mother, as her mother was very weak at the time of her birth. Her mother was dealing with headaches and stomach problems and was always sick around this time. In contrast, Megumi's father, though, was very healthy and was always working out and doing karate and was very athletic. Kudo has always felt like she got her athleticism from her dad, but her personality from her mom, as her mom was much more emotional, and why Kudo has always felt like she's been a crier her whole life. She also felt like she was injury-prone early on, as she always remembers getting injured, including one time playing with a razor and cutting her hand really bad, with her hand just covered in blood, and her dad having to take her to the hospital. Her dad also was an architect, which resulted in them having to move around a lot, as she ended up having to live in 4 different cities before she even started kindergarten. And because of having to move around a lot, she felt like she was really shy growing up, and when she actually ended up making a friend who was a boy in kindergarten, she became infatuated with him and fell in love with him, as she just dreamed of marrying him, as that was just kind of her goal back then when she was 5-6 years old. She just wanted to be a wife. She wanted to be married. Kudo, though, always felt like she was a heavier-set kid up until the 4th grade, when each kid had to join a sports club. Well, Kudo loved volleyball and swimming, but those clubs didn't exist in 4th grade, so she ended up having to join the basketball club. Well, she actually ended up being really good to her surprise, as there were 4 teams, and she was put on Team A, which meant she was on the best team, with the best players. The issue with Team A, though, was that they had to practice before school, during school, and then after school, and even though Kudo managed to lose a lot of the weight that she had gained early on when she was little, she didn't have much time for anything else besides basketball and schoolwork. Kudo continued to play basketball until finishing the 8th grade, and after that school year was almost over, her basketball coach ended up giving out free tickets to all the girls in the club that wanted to go to an All-Japan women's wrestling show that was coming up in the area. Kudo decided to go, and although she liked watching wrestling on TV, she never really had any type of passion for it, especially for women's wrestling, but after she attended this show live, she absolutely fell in love with it, and fell in love with the Crush Gals team of Shigusa Nagayo and Lioness Asuka. And a switch went off in her brain after this show, as this is what she wanted to do professionally from now on. She didn't even want to go to high school anymore. She wanted to be a professional wrestler. If she could have dropped out then and tried out for the All Japan Women's Dojo, she would have, but instead, for the next year and a half, she would train to be a pro wrestler, as that was her only focus. She exercised and trained every day with the goal of one day becoming an All Japan Women's wrestler. Then one day, she would hear that Crush Gal's Shigusa Nagayo was doing a signing, and she decided to skip school to meet her favorite wrestler. And when she finally got up to the front of the line to meet Nagayo and ask her for her autograph, Nagayo would ask her, "Why are you not in school?" And Kudo couldn't lie to her, and she just went quiet, as Nagayo would tell her that she hated when kids skipped school. So Kudo would never skip again, although her grades were not good because of all the focus that she did on training. Eventually, the day would come where Kudo would finally try out for the All Japan Women's promotion in January 1985 at the Fuji TV station. So Kudo, at the tryout, finds out that she is not alone in wanting to become an All Japan Women's wrestler. There are nearly 1,000 other girls there to try out because of how popular the Crush Gals were with so many teenage girls at this time. Kudo, though, would be able to get through the first stage of the tryouts, and the nearly 1,000 girls would become just 50 girls at the next stage, but she would not end up making the final cut. Other girls like Akira Hokuto and Yumiko Hara, they would end up making it, and Kudo's life would probably be a lot different if she had made this class, but instead she would have to go back to living with her parents and begin the 11th grade. Kudo would feel that she was lucky, though, as her parents would allow her to come back home after she had pretty much blown off school the previous year. But her main focus would continue to be train and get accepted into the 1986 All Japan Women's class. While Kudo was in school, many of the other students would find out about her nearly making the All Japan Women's promotion, and this made many boys go over and talk to her, knowing that she liked wrestling also. So they would go over and ask her stuff like, "Hey Megumi, did you see what Inoki did on TV last night?" It would finally become January 1986, and again, Kudo had pretty much blown off studying for her exams during this time period, like the previous year, and she knew her parents were not going to let her back in the house if she didn't end up making the roster this time because of how she had blown school off for training. All Japan Women's Pro Wrestling had gotten even more popular, though, throughout the past year, and now 2,500 girls were trying out for a roster spot. But Kudo remained confident with her years of training and working out for this moment, although she would get pretty nervous when they were calling names out, but she would end up hearing her name called, and now Megumi Kudo would begin her journey as a professional wrestler. Kudo would move into the All Japan Women's Dojo in March 1986, with her roommate being Aja Kong. Jaguar Yokota would be the trainer for all the girls, and they would train from 10 a.m. to 3 p.m. with a 1-hour lunch break, but then they would need to do night training until 7 p.m. due to reports that the All Japan Women's girls were just knowing the basics of wrestling, so they would be trained at an accelerated pace at night. Issues began to start at first for Kudo, as she felt like she had just ran out in the middle of the night on her parents by moving out to live in the dojo, as she would begin to feel homesick. Other issues would begin as her seniors at the All Japan Women's Dojo, while living there, would begin to give her issues. She felt like she couldn't do anything right. She uses the example, if they showed her the color white and told her to name that color, they would tell her she was wrong and that it was actually black. Kudo's first match was against Kaoru Maeda, and she doesn't really have any memories of this first match other than that she lost it. She does remember having her favorite match against Kyoko Aso for the vacant All Japan Women's Junior title on February 26, 1987 at the Kawasaki City Gym. This match would be a tournament finals match, and Aso would end up defeating Kudo for the All Japan Women's Junior Heavyweight title. Kudo would come back from the match and would be so emotional, but she knew she couldn't cry, as if you cried in the dressing room, it would result in the seniors yelling at you. But this time she noticed that no one was around there, and she just let loose and let all her tears out, before noticing that Bull Nakano actually was there. She had been in the background doing her makeup before her match in the locker room, as Nakano would come over, and Kudo would just stop crying when she noticed Nakano there, but Nakano wouldn't yell at her. She just sat next to her and let Kudo just try and compose herself. Kudo thought really highly of Nakano there, as she was a senior, and, Kudo had broken the rule of crying in the dressing room, but she didn't say anything, she didn't yell at her or anything, so Kudo thought very highly of Nakano for letting her do this, whereas any other senior would have let loose and yelled at her. Kudo eventually would end up joining different groups in the promotion, first joining the Devil Bombers, then eventually joining the Nagayo New Yorkers, but by no means did it seem like there was any future push coming for Kudo, as she remained on the undercard. Then Kudo ended up suffering a cracked sternum during one of her matches, but all the girls knew that if they were out for any length of time due to an injury, that they would end up falling behind, and the new girls coming in would come in and take their spot. Kudo would continue to wrestle as a result, but this injury would prevent her from actually wrestling well, and finally got to the point where Kudo could not deal with the pain anymore, and she went to the hospital, where they told her that if she continued to exercise the amount that she had been doing, that the broken bone could snap and pierce her lungs. Kudo took this as pretty much the doctors telling her to retire, but she kept all this quiet from AJW, but then she began to get stomach ulcers also. But that didn't stop her either, as she continued to train with all her issues, and instead would go to the hospital every day to get injections to keep her going throughout all her conditions. Her stomach issues continued though, and her sternum injury was not healing. She got to the point where every day she thought about quitting, as she didn't know why she was doing this anymore. Eventually, she got to the point where she felt like her seniors were going to tell her to quit anyway, due to her lack of progress with all her issues, as Kudo would decide to quit pro wrestling in March 1988. She wouldn't watch wrestling or read about it, as she was just done with it at this point. It took 5 days after quitting for her ulcers to stop, and then her sternum injury also managed to heal up soon afterwards. Kudo didn't want to go back to living with her parents, though, as she felt like she needed to make up for missing out on her youth over the previous 3 years, which included smoking, drinking, staying up past midnight, talking on the phone late, just things that she wanted to always do that she couldn't do as a part of AJW. She would end up running through her savings after about 6 months, and she would end up needing to get a job, so she would apply for a job at a hamburger store run by a husband and wife, where she would work as the waitress, wash the dishes, and work the cash register. She would make about $7 an hour working every day and was able to again save the money she made, and she was at a point in her life where if she had any money saved up and didn't have to work, she wasn't going to. So she would end up quitting the hamburger restaurant and planned on living off the money she had saved up, but right around that time she ended up getting contacted by Dump Matsumoto's manager and asked her to help out on a play that had wrestling in it, as she would help teach the actors the basics of the wrestling moves. This is where she would also once again meet Combat Toyota, as Combat Toyota had also recently quit All Japan Women's Wrestling, and she had been contacted about helping with the play as well. After that play, Kudo would be asked to work on some other plays where she would play the good-looking girl, including one of the plays where she would be getting married in it and wear a wedding dress. Her heart was not in these at all, though, and after a while she would stop auditioning for any other plays. Kudo would then find a job where they would tell her that she'd make a lot of money, and she would end up getting Toyota to join her as they would work together here, where they would stand on the side of the road and whistle with a red stick, guiding cars away from where the construction was on the road. But after Kudo's first day, she knew this job was not for her and she would quit. But Toyota would actually keep this job until she would end up joining FMW months later. Kudo would end up randomly walking around the neighborhood, still with no job, when she would see an ad for a child care assistant. This job intrigued her, but she didn't know if she would be hired because she never finished high school, but it didn't say she needed any qualifications. They didn't think it was a big deal, though, and would hire her. This would be Kudo's first job since pro wrestling that inspired her. She would play with the kindergarten kids until 10 a.m. when it was time to go into the classroom for milk. Then it was time to play some more before nap time. Then when the kids would wake up, she would give them their snacks and play with them some more until it was 4 p.m. and time for their parents to pick them up. Kudo loved this job, but child care assistants were only allowed to stay at one location for 3 months before going somewhere else. She went to the other location and finished that 3 months there, but then the third location was going to be too difficult for her to travel there every day, so she would end up having to quit this job even though she loved it. But right after she quit it, she would end up getting a call from another former AJW 1986 member, Raiben Amada. Amada had just quit AJW and wanted to meet up with Kudo. Now, Kudo's version of this story is kayfabed, but Kudo says that Amada, while they met up, asked her if she wanted to go to an FMW show, with Kudo not having any idea about what FMW was other than it was a wrestling promotion, as Kudo had pretty much not followed wrestling at all over the past year since leaving AJW. Kudo decided that since it wasn't AJW or JWP, another Japanese women's promotion, where she also knew some of the wrestlers in it, it was okay to go to this show. The only thing she knew about FMW was Onita by his name, that he was an All Japan wrestler back in the day. Kudo and Amada would go to the February 12, 1990 Corrigan Hall show, and they would end up seeing the women wrestling on the card, and they would both look at each other and go, "Wow, these girls are horrible. They're making women wrestling look really bad here with how horrible they were." So all this really did happen. Now, where the kayfabe comes in is that FMW actually asked Amada about her and some other girls that she knew about joining FMW because they knew how bad their women's roster was and they needed some girls that could actually wrestle. And Amada thought about Kudo first, so that's why she reached out to her about joining her. And then Kudo would reach out to Combat Toyota, who was still working the guiding away the cars from Row Construction job I mentioned a little while ago, and asked her if she wanted to join in on coming in to start working FMW, with Toyota agreeing, and all three would end up attending the March 10th, 1990 FMW Corrigan Hall show, sitting in the crowd, and again, they would be watching a horrible women's wrestling match, but this time, they would say they had enough of this, and they would all rush in the ring and begin attacking the FMW girls for being so bad, with the FMW fans booing them, which Kudo was not used to hearing at all. The three former All Japan Women girls would call themselves the Outbreakers, with their agenda being that they are going to show these horrible FMW girls how real women's wrestling is supposed to be. The Outbreakers would go the next 2 months of just destroying the FMW women's division, but FMW picked up right away that Kudo would be much better as a face, and they decided to break her away from the heel Outbreaker group. So they would turn Kudo face on May 19th, 1990 at Corrigan Hall after her and Amada would win their match. After the match, Amada and Toyota, they would try and get Kudo to cut Yuki Muramatsu's hair, with Kudo refusing to do so. So Amada would slap Kudo in the face and then cut Muramatsu's hair herself, and then go over and slap Kudo in the face again, with Kudo giving Amada a kick to the back as she exited the ring, which would officially break up the Outbreakers group, and Kudo is now going to be a babyface in FMW, which would lead to Kudo now feuding with both Toyota and Amada, which would include a street fight against Toyota on August 4th, 1990 at the Shiodome, with them brawling in the crowd in a really good match, with Toyota winning, and then Kudo would end up defeating Amada on November 5th, 1990, with Amada deciding to just retire from pro wrestling the following month. Now, Kudo admits that this first year was a struggle, and she wasn't the greatest worker, even though obviously she was much better than the regular FMW women's wrestlers. But she had not trained in over a year when she came in, and it was also difficult to get used to the ring that was made for men and was much harder than what she was used to in AJW. Kudo would continue to improve, though, and Onita saw her as another star for the promotion, a star that he didn't have to worry about losing any popularity or losing a spot to because she was a woman. So this was a win-win for Onita to push her, and so Megumi Kudo would end up winning her first women's title on March 28, 1991 at Corrigan Hall against Combat Toyota, and then that week she would end up appearing on the cover of Pro Wrestling Weekly, which was a really big deal back in 1991. And that cover was such a famous cover that Hana Kimura would end up reprising that cover for herself years later. The problem was, though, that the FMW women's roster was so thin, and the top girls in the division was even thinner. So there was only so much you could do with Kudo having the title, and to keep things fresh, they would end up taking the title off her and putting it back on Combat Toyota in August 1991, ending Kudo's title reign in less than 5 months. Then FMW would begin working with a Russian company to bring in talent, and they would end up bringing in Silvanta Gundarenko, who was a 6'3", 330-pound woman who was going to be in the 1992 Olympics for judo. FMW was going to be running their big Kawasaki Stadium show on September 23rd, 1991, and so they would throw Kudo out there against Gundarenko to get slaughtered by her, as Kudo would barely get any offense in at all, and Gundarenko would end up just handling her easily. They would then end up booking a rematch against the two on December 9th, 1991 for another big show, and although Kudo would end up getting a little more offense in this match, she would lose in even less time to Gundarenko, and this would frustrate Kudo so much that as she had been pushed as the top women's wrestler for the promotion, and now she's being used to be squashed multiple times by this big Russian woman with no plan of her ever getting her win back. Kudo would admit that all this would lead to the thought of retirement creeping into her mind for the first time. Kudo would overcome those thoughts, though, and continue to strive on, but like I mentioned earlier, there was just the issue of having such a thin FMW women's roster, so everyone was wrestling the same people every day, and it would just get monotonous. That would be until FMW's next big stadium show in Yokohama on September 19th, 1992, where the FMW office would reach out to All Japan Women's about having the very first interpromotional women's match in Japan, as the FMW team of Megumi Kudo and Combat Toyota would take on the All Japan Women's team of Bull Nakano and Akira Hokuto. This would be a surreal experience for Kudo, as during her All Japan Women days, both Nakano and Hokuto were both above the clouds to her back then, and now here she is facing them as equals at a big stadium show. Hokuto would go to the media and talk about how Kudo and Toyota were both just quitters that ran away from AJW because they couldn't handle it. And this experience was tense for both Kudo and Toyota, with Toyota saying after the match that if she wasn't teaming with Kudo, she might have just asked for the match to be canceled. The FMW and AJW relationship would continue, with Kudo and Toyota main eventing the All Japan Women's Dream Slam show on April 2nd, 1993 at the Yokohama Arena, with them losing to the team of Minami Toyota and Toshio Yamada in a match that would start after midnight because the show had ran so long. The FMW girls would get their win back a month later at the Kawasaki Stadium show for FMW on May 5th, 1993, which would eventually lead to Kudo challenging Aja Kong for the WWWA title on December 6, 1993 at Sumo Hall. This match was such a big deal for Kudo, as she grew up dreaming about holding the All Japan Women's red belt, which was the most prestigious belt in All Japan Women's, and not only that, but she was going to be facing off against her former roommate in the dojo and friend Aja Kong. Then you had Jaguar Yokota, who had trained both Kudo and Kong here, doing commentary for the match at ringside. This match felt like a graduation from All Japan Women's for Kudo, and although Kudo and Aja were friends while rooming in the dojo, they hadn't really stayed in contact over the years, and even though she went to the ring not knowing what Aja Kong was thinking, when she actually stood in the ring and looked at Aja's eyes, she knew exactly what she was thinking and what kind of match they were going to have. Although Kudo would end up losing to Kong, she would come away thinking the match was good and would be praised for it, as well as afterwards, backstage, she would openly begin to cry from all the emotions of this match, like she had 6 years earlier while being videotaped. Although FMW and All Japan Women's would continue their relationship, which would include Kudo defeating All Japan Women's Yumiko Hara at Kawasaki Stadium on May 5th, 1994, and then Kudo would wrestle in a random match at the Tokyo Dome for All Japan Women's on November 20th, 1994, the relationship really wasn't the same, and FMW would begin working with other women's promotions down the line. Going back a few months, though, to September 1993, Kudo dealt with something that really changed her. FMW didn't have the no smoking, no drinking, no boys rule that All Japan Women's had. Kudo was free to do what she wanted on her own time. The only thing was that she was known as a sex symbol at this point for FMW, and Onita didn't really want it to be known publicly if she was going on dates. So he told her that if you're going to go out with a boy, then you need to be camouflaged. Kudo needed to wear a hat and sunglasses and try to not be recognizable while she's out with a boy. And she would do that. She'd go on a couple dates wearing the hat and the sunglasses, but after a while, she would just go, "This is stupid. I'm not that big of a celebrity where I need to be covered up and wear a hat and sunglasses like this." And so she would end up going on a date, just dressed normally, and by the way, this is years before she began dating Hito. Then there would be this one time where Kudo was driving back to her apartment, and she would park in the parking lot when two men would walk up right to her car and begin knocking on her window. This would freak her out, but she would originally think, well, they're policemen and they must be doing a stakeout or something. So Kudo rolls the window down, and these two men go, "We're from the magazine Friday." Friday is a Japanese magazine that isn't a wrestling magazine, but they had done positive stories about FMW in the past about being this small promotion that was making it. They would tell her, though, that they had already gotten permission from her landlord to be on the property, and that they had been taking pictures of Kudo while she was out with the boy, and if she agreed to be interviewed by them, they would run her story with what she said. Otherwise, if she didn't, then they would just write their own story about it. Kudo would begin to freak out about this and go, "Let me go inside and let me call somebody." So she'd go into her apartment and call Onita on the phone, and she would tell Onita everything and begin apologizing to him that she had screwed up, worried that Onita was going to begin yelling at her because he had told her about this and how to prevent it. Onita would stay calm, though, and just tell Kudo to be interviewed by them because it was worthless to make the media your enemy. Kudo was relieved to hear that Onita was calm about the situation, though, as if he had begun to yell at her, she would have freaked out even more. So Kudo would go back into the parking lot and be interviewed by them, and after the magazine would be published, she would find out that she actually wasn't famous enough to be promoted on the cover of the magazine, as instead they would just promote it as secret photos taken of a beautiful pro wrestler. This would mess Kudo up, though. It would stay with her for years that she might be being photographed by someone and not even know it. The wrestling media, though, would always look out and protect Kudo and not ever mention the story in any of their publications. The wrestlers also would not say anything at first, although after some time had passed, it would be used as a joke sometimes around her. Kudo would also find out from one of the Friday reporters that they had been told exactly where Kudo was going to be for this date by a women's wrestler for a rival women's promotion, although Kudo didn't know whether or not to believe him. The only person that would seem to be upset at Kudo for all this would be Tarzan Goto. Although they were never really close friends, they still rode the babyface bus to the shows all the time, so there was going to be the awkwardness with Goto being upset at Kudo about this situation. Then not long after this, Goto would tell Kudo that he wasn't going to be training the FMW women anymore at the FMW dojo, and that she would need to come in every day going forward and train them instead while he trained the boys. Kudo was pretty upset at Goto about this though, as it was an added job coming in every morning to help train the girls, with Kudo never saying if she ended up getting paid extra for it or not. Kudo would continue to take the subway every morning when FMW wasn't touring and train the girls for the next couple years, when more rumors would begin to come out about her, as there would be reports that some of the younger girls that were at a low level at the FMW dojo were being bullied by her, which Kudo had always been public about feeling like she had been bullied during her All Japan Women days. Then Mitsuhiro Matsunaga, who became very close friends with Kudo on the FMW bus in 1994, they would end up sitting together every day, going from show to show, and then they would even hang out together, as Matsunaga was engaged during this time, but definitely had a soft spot for Kudo and their friendship, as they even had hung out one time at a waterfall and had a picnic together before Matsunaga would try practicing doing a moonsault into the water in front of Kudo in preparation for him trying out this moonsault in a singles match against Hayabusa in September 1995. Well, Matsunaga would end up finding out that Hito and Kudo were getting married in 1998, and he had heard about these rumors about Kudo bullying the younger girls. So Matsunaga, despite having the soft spot for Kudo, wanted to know if his friend Hito was going to be marrying someone that seemed nice to everyone, but inside was really mean and hurtful. So Matsunaga would reach out to all the former FMW dojo girls after they had all left FMW, and none of them would say that Kudo had bullied them. So Matsunaga would give his friend the blessing to marry Kudo, feeling like all those rumors about her bullying were indeed false. Regardless though, Kudo was still not in a happy spot during this time. Like I said, being photographed secretly stayed with her, and now she was having to train the FMW girls when she wasn't touring, and when she was on tour, she was hurting, and again having the same matches with the same girls every night for the most part. The thought of retirement came back into her mind in 1994, but soon after that, the May 5th, 1994 Kawasaki Stadium show took place, with Onita losing to Tenryu, and then he would announce that he would be retiring 1 year after that on May 5th, 1995, which meant Kudo could not announce any retirement for the next year, as she didn't want to try and take away anything from Onita's upcoming retirement. Then, after Onita retired, she felt the pressure that she needed to keep going because FMW needed her help to survive with the loss of Onita, as FMW was going to try and regain a new following. Then, after a couple months, with May 5th, 1996 Kawasaki Stadium show looming, Combat Toyota would announce that she would be retiring instead, so Kudo would end up having to wait another year up until 1997 to finally retire. With Onita retiring, though, that would open up a spot for Kudo to do something she had never got a chance to do while Onita was on top, and that was become the Jado Princess. With Onita retiring, that made Hayabusa become the top FMW wrestler, and he wanted the men to originally not do any of the deathmatch stuff, since his stuff was more wrestling-based, and FMW without Onita doing death matches wasn't going to be the same. There were no issues with Kudo and the other girls becoming more hardcore, though, as that was just different. FMW would really do bad the first couple months, though, on the house show circuit without Onita, and the pressure from many of the wing wrestlers would begin with the FMW office allowing the men to go back to doing death matches, although Kudo and Shark Tsuchiya had already established a blood feud at this point. It started first with Shark Tsuchiya wrapping barbed wire around Kudo's body, and then they would use a barbed wire stick in one of their matches, and then they would have the first women's barbed wire match on September 5th, 1995 in Sapporo, with Kudo and Combat Toyota taking on Shark Tsuchiya, Maya Sato, and Bad Nurse Nakamura, although this match would not be the main event, and as a result, the request of it being a no-ropes barbed wire death match would be rejected, with the reason being that it would take too long for them to undo the ropes, and then have to put the ropes back on for the other matches. Although Kudo would end up getting the win in this match, she would get bloodied from the barbed wire, which backstage afterwards, Hayabusa would freak out seeing her face covered in blood, which was not something you saw a woman wrestler covered in blood at this point. The rivalry would heat up as Toshiya would end up blowing a fireball at Kudo's head with her hair catching on fire. This would lead to the first no-ropes barbed wire women's death match for an FMW women's only show on December 22nd, 1995 at Corrigan Hall, and this match would give Kudo so much anxiety going into it as she would be main eventing this show and it was a complete sellout for a women's only show. Kudo's anxiety would also come from being worried about having to have a good match with Toshiya, as Toshiya's knees were really bothering her at this point, and she was not going to be able to do much for this match. So Kudo decided for this match, she was going to have to bleed. So Kudo would end up getting cut open and bleeding all over, much more than the previous barbed wire match 3 months earlier, as Toshiya would end up using her sickle and just cut open Kudo's face, with her whole face just covered in blood, as Kudo would end up getting the win after debuting her new finisher, the Kudo Driver, and afterwards Kudo would state that she was criticized by a lot of people for doing death matches and bleeding, but the truth is that Kudo actually loved doing these, as becoming the Jado Princess actually prolonged her career. Kudo would then have a match with her childhood idol, Shikusa Nagayo, on January 10th, 1996, although this match would not even go 7 minutes before Nagayo would end up picking up the win. Kudo afterwards would say she hates making excuses, but this was just 2 weeks after the barbed wire match with Toshiya, and her body had just not really recovered from that match before being put up against such a top-level competitor in Nagayo. The truth is that while Kudo, of course, didn't mind losing to her idol, she hates the politics of working with a different promotion that would dictate that she would lose rather easily, as Kudo hated when she felt like she was being squashed. Afterwards, Combat Toyota would then make her announcement that she was going to be retiring at the May 5th, 1996 Kawasaki Stadium show, and would name Kudo as her retirement opponent for the very first no-ropes exploding barbed wire women's death match, as 2 of the sides of the ropes were going to have explosions, and the other 2 ropes were just going to be barbed wire, with both Kudo and Toyota apparently not knowing which side had the explosions to them. Kudo would end up waking up the morning on May 5th in Kawasaki at a hotel to the sound of loud pouring of raindrops. At first, it would not look like they were even going to be able to have a show that day because of how bad it was raining. But then throughout the day, it would just turn into steady rain, and while they would be able to put on their show that day outside, Kudo was nervous as all the matches would be taken down a notch due to the fans' attention being on the fact that they were being rained on instead. Which thankfully the rain would stop and the sun would come out right before the start of the show, as fans were already in the stadium when it would stop, and there would be no rain throughout the show. Kudo would walk into the ring at Kawasaki Stadium, already dark, and the nervousness of the explosions on top of this being Toyota's retirement match made her have to hold back from crying. Kudo and Toyota throughout the years were really the only women in FMW that became great and improved throughout the years to where they could have a great match. Toshiya, she had improved to the point where she could be a good brawler, but Kudo and Toyota, they had become great together, and they were going to take everything they had learned against each other over the years and use it one last time for this match. And they would have an incredible straight match that also had explosions around them, with Kudo going into the exploding barbed wire first, and she would say that she had always heard people that had felt those explosions not be able to put that feeling into words, and after going into the exploding barbed wire herself, she knew exactly what they meant after feeling it. Then there was a spot where Kudo was going to do her running hip attack at Toyota, but as she was in the air, Toyota would catch her, and Toyota had the ability to just throw Kudo into the exploding barbed wire herself, but just because of the decade of love and friendship that the two had, Toyota would instead go into the explosion with her to prevent Kudo from possibly getting seriously injured, and Toyota's back and neck would end up getting most of the damage. Kudo would then deliver a powerbomb on Toyota, and due to Toyota's weight and the pure exhaustion the two had, it would not be a fully formed powerbomb, with Toyota taking the brunt of the damage on her neck, before Kudo would then end up dropping her on her neck again with the Kudo driver, as Kudo would end up picking up the win. Onita, who was in the crowd watching the match, would come over into the ring and begin pouring water on both of them, as Kudo would need a stretcher to be taken to the back, and Onita would help walk Toyota to the back as well. Onita would then bring Toyota backstage and place her on a table as Kudo was laying there on the floor on the stretcher. And as Toyota noticed her, she would drop her body down onto the floor and go over to Kudo, and both of them would not say a word to each other and just begin crying from all the emotion that they had just went through, as well as having one of the greatest FMW matches of all time. The next big show for FMW would take place on August 1st, 1996 at the Shiodome, where Onita and Goto had their first exploding barbed wire death match. Kudo would go to FMW president Shoichi Arai and ask him if she could main event this show and have an exploding barbed wire death match with Salvanta Gaundarinko, as Kudo wanted to get her win back from being squashed by her twice 5 years earlier. The 1996 Olympics were coming up as well, and with Gaundarinko being in the 1992 Olympics, this would be the time for Gaundarinko to come back and Kudo to face her. As Gaundarinko had just done business with Shinobu Kandori in LLPW back in October 1995, with Kandori getting the win. Kudo was struggling, though, getting Gaundarinko to agree to come back to FMW for this show. In the meantime, a sponsor had ended up buying the show from FMW, and Mr. Pogo now wanted to be in the main event instead in an exploding barbed wire death match. So with the show being bought, it was no longer Arai's decision on who would main event, although Kudo would refuse to give up the match, but she just couldn't get Gaundarinko to agree to this match, and eventually Pogo would end up setting up a meeting with the sponsor and Kudo, with Pogo getting the right to the exploding barbed wire death match instead, although that would be the match that Pogo would end up breaking his neck. Kudo would instead end up being in a handicap match where she would again bleed, but the match would not be good at all, and the next month, Kudo would announce her plan to retire at the May 5th, 1997 Kawasaki Stadium show, although that show would end up getting canceled due to Kawasaki Stadium being worked on during that time period, and instead the match would be moved to the Yokohama Arena on April 29th, 1997. This would then lead to Megumi Kudo's retirement match in the main event of the Yokohama Arena on April 29, 1997. At this point, Onita had came back out of retirement and was on the show as well and wanted to be in the main event, as he just felt like he always should be in the main event of FMW. But Arai, being the president, would tell Onita no, that this would be Kudo's day and she would be in the main event of an FMW show with men on it for the first time. And her opponent would be Shark Tashia, and it would be a no-ropes exploding barbed wire, exploding barricade death match, so there would be exploding barbed wire outside the ring as well. And Kudo would know that she couldn't have the match that she had with Toyota the previous year, and so for this match, she knew she was going to have to go through some really painful stuff to help get this match over. And that would include Tashia power-bombing her off the apron into the exploding barbed wire barricade. Kudo would land on her head and at first initially think that she had banged her head up against the concrete, even though she had landed on the barricade, and then a split second later, the explosion of the barbed wire would go off. Kudo would then try to get up, but she would be too tangled up from the barbed wire to just get up, and it would take some time to get out of it, and that's when she would feel a flame from the explosion begin to get onto her attire as she would finally manage to get up. Tashia would then light a fireball at Kudo's head, with referee Go Ito having to help put out the fire as she could smell the burning from her hair afterwards. Eventually the finishing spot would see Kudo and Tashia go into the exploding barbed wire together, with Kudo landing on top of her as she was too weak to do a finishing move anyway on Tashia, as Kudo would get the win in her retirement match. Kudo would be taken to the hospital afterwards, where she would spend the night due to burns and cuts to her head, shoulder, and armpit from this match. Kudo would be in pretty rough shape following the match and would cancel a TV interview as a result, and it would take a month and a half to get her to the point where she could appear at an FMW show for her official retirement ceremony. One of the reasons Kudo stated she retired was because she felt like the women's division would never be able to grow with her there. The other FMW girls that she had helped train would always be in her shadow, and she needed to retire to give them the opportunity to shine. Well, 1 year later, FMW would end up ending their women's division without Kudo, as Tashia would leave FMW, and all the other girls that Kudo wanted to get the spotlight to would either also leave or just retire, besides Kaori Nakayama, who would end up leaving FMW in 2001 and then retire in 2002 against Shark Tashia. Kudo would end up getting married to Hito in July 1998, as the two had began secretly dating in her last year of FMW. They would end up getting married in a church, and then have a ceremony afterwards with Onita and Koto Fuyuki speaking at the ceremony, as well as Yukihiro Kanamura reading a poem that would be too sexual to ever be repeated. Onita would ask Kudo to come out of retirement in December 1998 for his own show, but Kudo would say no to him, as she did not want to break her retirement vow. Kudo would end up getting a job working for the daily news show on Samurai TV, where she would go over wrestling highlights and interview other wrestlers. She would do that job for about 3 years before just getting a normal job, as Hito would continue to wrestle, and the two would live together in a decent-sized house in Chiba with their 2 dogs, as Kudo would end up appearing randomly for some Onita-promoted shows before she would start promoting her own FMW reunion shows with the likes of Combat Toyota, Hayabusa, and Masato Tanaka, which I had the pleasure of attending one of those in 2012. Kudo would end up coming back to pro wrestling in 2015 with the 01 promotion, where she would do PR and be a spokesperson for them, before a new sponsor would show up in 2020 and was a big FMW and Megumi Kudo fan, and so they would hire Kudo to once again begin training the women for the planned 01 women's division, although after about a year, the plan for that division would be scrapped. The sponsor would then ask Kudo to finally come out of retirement, with her agreeing to kind of a match. The match would be against Shark Tashia on December 26, 2020, although it wouldn't really be a match, as it would be more of a play of them redoing some of their more famous spots against one another, with neither actually taking a bump, as Tashia was walking on a prosthetic leg at this point, and eventually Maya Sato would hit the ring and attack Kudo and help Shark Tashia hang her over the top rope, as the referee would just throw the match out and rule it a no contest. Sadly, in October 2021, Kudo would announce the passing of her husband, Hito. Hito had gotten really sick from liver damage and lost a lot of weight, to where he was almost unrecognizable and would have to retire from pro wrestling in 2013, as he just couldn't do it anymore. Kudo would end up having to take care of him as his condition got a lot worse, and besides Hito going out to take a picture with Mitsuhiro Matsunaga in 2019, they would actually keep everything about his condition private. Kudo would announce the passing of her husband after the funeral, wanting to keep it private. And then a couple months afterwards, Kudo would do an interview with Bull Nakano, where she would talk about how life has been really difficult, and there are times she just wants to be alone, but then there are times she wants to go out with her friends, but she doesn't want to be selfish after just having told them that she wanted to be alone. Kudo also said that she had moved back into her parents' house for the first time since she was 16, when she left their house to join the All Japan Women's Dojo in 1986. Kudo wants to put her focus on her love of pro wrestling and her job with 01 to keep her mind off things for the time being, but she is in a better place right now than she was the first month following Hito's passing. And that is pretty much it. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you want to check out more about FMW, I have a website, bahufmw.com or fmwwrestling.us, where I have over 20 years worth of FMW information listed, as well as a Megumi Kudo biography with pictures included that I wrote back in 2012. I also sell DVDs and MP4s of pretty much every FMW show to make tape, as well as many other promotions from Big Japan to 01 to Freedoms to the new FMWE promotion. Also, if you want to just watch these shows on YouTube, you can just search Brett FMW and it'll pop up. Or if you want to just listen to them, they're posted under the name History of FMW on all the podcast sites like iTunes and Spotify, among many others. And that is pretty much it. Thank you guys so much. I'll see you next time.
You and me.